Okay, as I mentioned, there were 6 VC amendments that were introduced as part of the program so far. By far the largest and the most far-reaching was VC 148, which was gazetted on the 31st of July this year. So I'm going to hand over to Jason Pullman to take you through that. There will be quite a comprehensive run-through of that amendment. And again, if there are any questions, if you could please save them to the end of the session, and Jason and the rest of the team will answer them.
Okay, thanks Rick. All right, so yeah, Jason Pullman, Track Planning Consultants, been working with DELWP for a bit longer than 12 months now. Had the pleasure of working with DELWP on a pretty important reform to the system and VPPs in particular. Thank you. The last time I was involved in such a reform as this was back in the late 90s with regards to the transitioning the old schemes into the new format planning schemes. So if you think about that, that's almost 20 years ago. And the idea about smart planning is to make sure that we don't do reforms every 20 years, but we do them on a more consistent and gradual basis. So if we get to that end of the 20 years, it's not such a big push as it has been with the current reforms. So Rick mentioned 6 VC amendments that we've delivered, and in essence, all aimed at simplifying and the process and sort of removing some of the regulatory burden, and part of that is through removing unnecessary permit triggers as well. So, but for me, simplification and a more usable system in an electronic sort of world as we move forward. So VC 148, it's done a few things, and I don't know if you guys like metrics. Some people go crazy about metrics, but I like them. Specifically in regards to VC 148, you're looking at 8,000 pages have been removed from planning schemes as a result of VC 148. We've updated 224 out of the 300 VPPs out of the suite of VPPs, so that's we've touched almost every clause if you think of it like that, state clause. We've also updated 1,250 schedules, local schedules, as a result of VC 148. There's a bit more to do on schedules, which we'll talk about later, but and we've also introduced a new PPF. So if you combine those, even those changes that we've done to date, and there's a lot more to come, that's some pretty significant reforms. So Rick mentioned that VC 148 was gazetted on 31st of July, not that long ago. Does a few key things, does a lot of things, but in general it restructures the VPP. And when I talk about the VPP, I focus on a couple of bits. I call it now the new clause 50s. So in other words, the new clause 50s is a restructure of the particular provisions. And I'll refer to an image soon that further explains that. We've also integrated VicSmart. As we know, VicSmart used to live up the back of the schemes. Now we've put it in the zones and overlays, so it's easier to locate, it's more prevalent. We've also consolidated the operational and administrative provisions, what I call the new clause 70s. And I'll go through these in a little bit more detail in a minute. With regards to the integrated planning policy framework, I call that the clause 10s. So as you can see, I like to break things up because it's easy to remember. With regards to the new PPF, or the planning policy framework, 3 sort of dot points stand out for me. One is that it's a new sort of 3-tiered integrated policy structure, state, regional and local. We've updated some policy themes as well as introducing some new themes. And we've integrated regional policy in with that, and Jenny will talk in more detail about that. Now, I understand this particular image comes from Advisory Note 72. I understand there are A3 hard copies on the back table if you haven't seen those already. But this is probably my second favourite slide in the presentation. And I know it's hard to read from there, so apologies for that. And that's the good thing about colours. I like colours in planning schemes. If you just think of it in this way, broken up into three sections, the new structure of the VPPs. The purple section, as you can see that on the top part of the image there, is the policy settings section. So the orange section is the decision rules section, and the blue section is the operational sort of provision section. And the other thing to note with this image, when you can have a look at the detail, is that a couple of things to note. And one is wherever there's a dark shading of a colour, for instance, you can see in the purples in the top there, anything that has a dark colour like a purple is pretty much a clause where we've made some substantial changes or changes. The colours in the orange section, in the middle section, for instance, in the decision rules section, the lighter oranges, we haven't really touched those sections too much, but you'll notice in the clause 50s there, in the decision rules section, in the particular provisions, there's a few orange boxes in there, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to talk about those sections that we've sort of made some changes to. And down the bottom, the whole section is sort of the blue, which are the administrative section. The other thing to note is the white boxes on the image illustrate or identify new clauses. So there's a bit of a key and a way to read that. The other thing that you might note is wherever we have not used a clause number or that we've moved a clause from one clause to another, there'll be a no content clause there, and we've tried not to change the clause numbers too much if we could help it, because I know particularly stat planners love getting used to remembering clause numbers. So instead of creating too much chaos, we've tried to simplify that where possible. And if you do look through the provisions, and you probably already have, you'll note some no content clauses, but that's the reason for that. Okay, so I'm going to have a quick chat about the orange section, as I call it, or the decision rules section, and that's an image of a zoom in of that previous slide that you just saw. Hopefully you can read that one. As I said, there is hard copies on the back table, A3 hard copies of the bigger structure of the VPPs. So I'll probably focus on the 50s section just for this next bit, and that talks about restructuring the particular provisions. So if you think about clauses 52, 53 and 57, they've been organised into three categories. And those three categories you can see there as provisions that apply to a specified area, provisions that require enabler exempt permit, and general requirements and performance standards. The reason for that was it's a bit of a reshuffle. We just tried to group things that had a like intent or outcome to make it more simpler and easier to use. So that's new clauses 51, 52 and 53, and in clause 51 you'll still see specific provisions such as green wedge or provisions for Melbourne Airport, for example. In clause 52, on the screen there, you'll still see your native veg, your bushfire, your car park and your sign type provisions. In clause 53, which is the next dark box along, you'll still see your performance standards and codes of practice type clauses, forestry, greyhound codes of practice. You'll still see your public open space requirements and other things live in there, like brothels and things like that. So that's where they've all been shifted into those sections. That's been a major change. With regards to VicSmart, VicSmart hasn't really changed other than where it's now located. So the intent in its operation hasn't changed, it's still as it was. With regards to, and all that stuff was in clause 92, so with regards to those changes, as I mentioned before, they've been moved to sit with the zones and overlays mostly. So they're now throughout the scheme as opposed to at the end of the scheme, what I used to call a scheme within a scheme almost. So there's been a few of those examples where you've got sort of schemes within schemes, and I'll talk about another example of that later. The information requirements and decision guidelines for VicSmart have been moved into the particular provisions in clauses 59 to 59.14. And you will see that at the end of the right hand side there, the dark box there, VicSmart application requirements. There's a couple of, sorry, put it back. There's a couple of, no? Okay, there we go. Local Vic Smart variations. Councils have an opportunity to introduce local Vic Smart applications or vary the requirements at the moment. That's not new, that existed for some time. Geelong and Ballarat utilise that mechanism. We haven't integrated those into zones and overlays, so just a note there. That probably will be done at a later date sometime down the track. The information requirements and guidelines for local Vic Smart applications are in 59.16, however, so that's the only exception to that rule. But Vic Smart operates as is, just easier to find, I guess is the message. With regards to the what I call the blue section, or the operational provisions, okay. If you think about, we've essentially consolidated those operational or administrative provisions. So if you remember the old way we used to do it, there used to be a heap of, this is how this zone or overlay operates, particularly in clauses 31, 41 and 51, and how Vic Smart operates in clause 91, that's the old clauses. We've now consolidated those together into this operational provisions section. We've also put in some operational provisions for the new municipal planning strategy, which Jenny will talk about in a minute. I won't go into detail about that, but so again, it's an operational and administrative provision. So you're getting themes of grouping things together. Also, incorporated documents previously in clause 81 now live in this section, the operational provisions. There's a new, well, what we used to call the old way reference documents. They're now called background documents. They're now included in the operational provisions. That's a new clause, but essentially think of it as reference documents. And Jenny might have a chat to us about the reason why that terminology's changed as well. The land use terms, sign terms, definitions, they're in here as well. Meaning of terms, clause 73, as you can see on the screen there. There's also, if you remember, in the LPPF, councils usually have a sort of strategic implementation or a strategic work program in their MSS. Not all councils do, but most do. There's a spot for that as well in clause 74. Obviously clause 74 wouldn't apply until the transition is carried out. So when you transition your LPPF over to the new PPF, then clause 74 kicks in. Otherwise it's not applicable across the state at the moment because there hasn't been a translation as yet. So speaking about the new PPF, my colleague Jenny, I'm going to pass over to her and she'll give you some more information about that element. Thanks, Jen.
Hi. So I'll take you through the new planning policy framework, PPF, which has replaced our SPPF, the old state planning policy framework. So, hang on, I should move the slides. So we've gone to a single policy source, which has enabled state and local policies to be sort of parked in one spot and merged into the one policy source. And so it's laid out in 3 tiers. We've got state policy at 2 levels in statewide and regional, and then we've got the local planning policy as well. Now, regional policy includes sub-regional policies as well, so that's things like the 6 metro regional areas. You could have the land use framework plans, some policy that might come out of that, laid out in that, at that level of policy as well. Now, with the VC 148, as well as introducing the framework, we've had regional policy from clauses 1106 to 1115 integrated into the PPF, so that's on that thematic basis. So they're all in 1106 to 1115 now, but you'll find that sort of filtered through the PPF on that subject basis. So the benefits of the PPF, the goal was to improve its operation, and once we have fully integrated PPFs with the local policy in place there as well, we'll have a strengthened planning policy framework. We'll have much better alignment between state and local planning policy. We'll have a framework that's much easier to navigate and use, and there'll be more of a chance of, I suppose unavoidable for it to be consistent and concise. So the sort of repetition that we see today, we hope we'll avoid with this new framework. It will also simplify the review and update of policy because we'll be dealing with so much less content. We, in the process of the reform of the policy set in the SPPF, we've updated a whole lot of the policy themes. So there've been general updates all the way through, but some key changes might be things like river corridor policy, where we've expanded that out to include waterways, lakes and wetlands. And that example just flows from a lot of analysis that we did in local policies where we found gaps in local policy. We've sort of had to plug those gaps at that state policy level. Natural hazards and climate change, that's another new policy that we have at clause 13. But that's an interim policy response awaiting some more climate change policy project outcomes at state level. There's a new clause 1307, amenity. That clause deals with the management of uses and their associated amenity impacts where there isn't a natural theme for that content to sit elsewhere in the PPF. So that's stuff like non-residential uses in res zones. You could put a local policy under that clause. Caretakers' residences in industrial zones, and perhaps licensed premises policies can go in there as well. Now, clause 15, built environment, that's had a fairly major overhaul, but pretty much based on the new urban design guidelines, or relatively new urban design guidelines. It responds to that more contemporary content that we have there, and we've updated the PPF policy to match. And another big one that councils would be interested in is clause 1103, which is planning for places. And that's a clause where you can put your place-based policies in, but there is a set of rules around how you use that so that we don't dissolve the framework and have a whole lot of thematic policy just sort of parked in that planning for places space. So a new practitioner guide will set out those rules. To see the PPF themes, those sort of the big changes that we've had in the old SPPF sort of framework, Advisory Note 71 has an attachment at the back, and it gives you a really good snapshot of the key headings that we have in the PPF. It follows the diagram that Jason talked about earlier. But it's that sort of dark purple bit sort of blown out with all the subjects. We've also, one thing that VC 148 didn't do is modify or move our PPF content into the PPF. And so that's really the next phase of work that we're all about to launch into. And really what we're doing is moving local policies into the PPF, a new municipal planning strategy and relevant local schedules. Today I'll just take you through the framework, but Rick will take you through the translation program a little bit more about what the way forward is for that piece of work. Now, as well as the SPPF being updated and reformed, Jason mentioned that we've got operational provisions for we had the operational provisions from clause 10 and they've been moved with the other operational provisions in clause 71. Now the municipal planning strategy is the new sort of policy space or overarching policy space for local planning policy. So when a planning policy translates its LPPF into the new PPF, it'll be introducing a new NPS at the same time, and that's at clause 2. Now, the NPS supports but is not part of the PPF. It sets the scene for a planning scheme, so it gives you the context, the vision, and the overarching strategic directions. And the PPF and the NPS, they work together to form the strategic basis of a planning scheme. Now, the NPS differs from an MSS that we have today in that it's a much more succinct, strategic document at about 10 pages. With the average MSS being about 60 pages at the moment. So with, some are more, some are less, but the average is about 60. Its role is a bit different as well though. So, with the PPF and other clauses taking on some of the role of the MSS, the NPS only takes on part of that role. And it also differs from local policy, where they give the detailed policy directions, where we've got an NPS that gives you the sort of overarching directions. We've also introduced transitional provisions to make the LPPF continue to operate in this transitional stage. So you'll find them in clause 23 and clause 71. Resulting from a whole lot of review work that we did of our PPFs, we've also learnt that there's content in there that in our reformed PPF would not belong in the reformed PPF. So we've got content that we've moved, that we're in a stage where we'll be moving it out of the local planning policy space, and it will go into local schedules instead. So we've amended a series of overlays to include things like objectives, statements of significance or risk, application requirements and decision guidelines. Clause 4301 has been amended to allow for statements of significance and precinct-specific heritage design guidelines to be attached as incorporated documents. And as well as application requirements to be cited in the schedule to that clause. And the reason for that is because we've seen a lot of that content go into local planning policies and really sort of blow out that policy space. So we've sort of moved that content to a more sort of logical space for it to sit. Gaming, clause 5228, the schedule's been amended to accommodate more of that local policy content that we see today in local planning policy frameworks. So now you can specify objectives, application requirements, locational and venue guidelines and decision guidelines. And as well as that, clause 7208, the background documents, we've got the clause, you'll all be familiar with the list of incorporated documents that we have in planning schemes. This is a similar list of background documents, so our old reference documents that operate the same way. It's just an opportunity to list your background documents all in one spot. What we learned from doing the regional policy integration was that if we continued with a model where we had citations of background documents within the policy framework, we're going to have the same document sort of repeated a lot because it sort of gets split out thematically, particularly those bigger sort of strategic documents that are municipal wide, for instance. So this is where you might have a background document that's directly relevant to a policy and very usefully informs a local policy. You can cite it, within the PPF, but where you think it might be repetitively referenced, then you've got the opportunity to list that there in the clause 7208. Just some administrative information about the new framework. The the way we've laid it out administratively is much like what you know of the SPPF, but what we've done is at the section level or sub clause level, you'll find an S, an R or an L that identifies whether you've got a state policy, a regional policy or a local policy. They'll be laid out in that order, but you'll have that useful little suffix at the end of every clause number that tells you. So they'll use the same clause number, you'll see with that regional, you might see, I don't know how good your eyes are. So that's a shortcut way of knowing what level of policy you're looking at. Also with local policy headings, they don't have to directly match the state or regional heading. So in this example, we don't. The regional policy has its unique heading that properly informs what that content is about, although it needs to link back to the content that we have at the state level. So the same would go for local policy. So one example would be the tourism policy example, where you might have facilitating tourism as the heading at state level, perhaps tourism in the Gippsland region as a regional policy, and a local policy might be nature-based tourism in the Shire. Now, there are format requirements for policy now in Annexure 3 of the Ministerial Direction of Form and Content. The municipal planning strategy, some key things there are, there's the 5,000 word limit now, but that doesn't include strategic framework plans. So we've learned through our testing that a lot of information can be delivered very efficiently through strategic framework plans. And then otherwise you've got your context discussion, your vision and your strategic directions that you can set out in the MPS. Local planning policy, it'll look very much like what you're familiar with at state policy level. So you'll have objective strategies and our new version of policy guidelines. So it's not a list of documents, it's I suppose more policy but more detailed policy that explains how you might achieve an objective or a strategy. And there's also a policy application heading as well that you'll have at the front where needed, if you need to specify that a policy applies to a specific area or a specific zone or a specific land use type. And of course the policy documents, you can list that at the end. Now there's a practitioner's guide which will be released shortly that will, among other things, help guide how to write an MPS and how to write a local planning policy. And we're just about to release a local planning policy framework translation manual that'll help guide the translation of our PPFs. Now this table is pretty much just laying out the sort of clauses that we're dealing with in, like before VC 148, where we would have had an SPPF and we've moved across to a PPF in that middle column there. And the only addition at the moment is also a new clause 23, which is the LPPF operation. And that's just, I'm just talking about the core sort of policy content here. There are of course the other changes that we've made to the scheme as based on the policy work. Once a scheme has had its LPPF translated, you'll have clause 2, which is the municipal planning strategy. You'll continue to have your PPF. And you'll also have the clause 7401, which is the application of zones and overlay provisions, and potentially the further strategic work if this is content that you currently have. As well as the advisory notes that have been released with the amendment and the practitioner's guide and the LPPF translation guide. There's also some FAQs that you'll find on the website as well that give you some sort of useful answers to some of the questions that we've often come across so far. So that's me in the PPF. I'll hand you over to Jason and we'll take questions on Jason's commentary and mine at the end of Jason's next talk.
Okay, how are we going? There's a lot of information in a consolidated period. So thanks for bearing with us. Questions after this short session, next session. Just a couple of things. All right. So Jenny's just talked about the purple section, which is the policy sections, policy settings, the clause 10s, my words. I've already had a chat with you about the decision rules, clause 50s and whatnot, and the operational provisions, which is the blue section, clause 70s. So I can't help but break the scheme up into these colours and chunks. It just helps me digest the new system or the new provisions. Okay. So what I should also ask a question. Who here has seen that diagram with the three colours on it before? Excellent. Half, excellent. That's a good thing. I like that. With regards to VC 148, let's get into some detail. And I think this is the sexy part of VC 148. I do like the colours, but let's get into some detail. All right. So what is this? This doesn't list everything VC 148 has done to some clauses. So we're going to talk about clause content now instead of structure, and we will come back to the PPF stuff in a minute with questions. So what are the big ticket items? Well, you guys might have used in the past the priority development zone, which is at clause 3706. We're basically phasing that out. But the reason why is we did a bit of an audit of when and where that's been used across the state. It hasn't been used for about 5 years. It occurs in about 10 instances across the state. And as part of our sort of audit of where this priority development zone currently applies, we had a look to see if there were other zones or other provision zones or overlays that could take its place, replace the priority development zone. And in a number of the examples that we found, the comprehensive development zone, and this was a bit of a surprise to me, but the activity centre zone as well could have been used in those instances. Not obviously both of those zones, but one or the other, or a more appropriate zone. So the feeling was, in an effort to simplify the VPPs, we would phase out the priority development zone. Now I should state that the ministerial direction on the form and content of schemes prevents the priority development zone being used or a new schedule being created. But the ministerial direction does allow amendments to the existing PDZ schedules. So it's a phase out as opposed to an elimination. But the intent is to not use that zone in the future. Okay, so this one, the next one is the specific controls overlay, which is a brand new overlay. Now, if you remember, at clause 5203, the specific sites and exclusions clause, that's the old clause, the intent is to replace that with a new overlay, the specific controls overlay, which is to be at clause 4512. Now, the thinking behind that one is that, and you heard me mention before a scheme within a scheme. Well, this is a classic example, specific sites and exclusions. It's a pretty much do whatever you want and forget about the rest of the scheme. Not quite, but in effect that's the message. So what we were finding when we did our discussion paper in December or late last year, and we got a lot of feedback late last year. One of some of the feedback that we received was they didn't like the submitters or the feedback that we received raised the issue that people didn't like things being hidden in schemes. And this was one of the ones that popped up quite frequently. So we attempted to address that. We have addressed that by introducing a new specific controls overlay, which effectively, where possible, maps where these specific controls apply. Now, it can't be mapped in all instances, but the majority of these specific sites can be mapped and included as an overlay. which is much more upfront for punters using the scheme, and it appears in property information certificates and things like that as well. The other thing to note on this, and again in the ministerial direction on the form and content, prevents the use of the specific sites and exclusions clause as it currently exists, subject to a 3-month transition period from gazettal. So from the end of July, 3 months leading on. If you've got an amendment in train, well, that transitional period allows for that under the ministerial directions. And Rick will talk more about the some work being done on stage 3 with regards to that overlay. Now, we've also deleted 3 particular provisions. So we had a look at the VPPs, particularly the particular provisions, and tried to identify ones that didn't appear upon first instance to add any value. And what I mean by value, I'm talking about outdated and sort of unnecessary regulatory burden upon the users of the system. The three that came up, again through feedback, through discussion paper work, was clause 5212, service station, clause 5213, car wash, and clause 5214, motor vehicle, boat and caravan sales. That obviously references the old clause numbers. The reason why we thought they were probably unnecessary to be to continue to exist in the scheme was because they didn't really add any value. Now, if you actually have a look at the provisions that were in those clauses, they hadn't really changed much since the introduction of the VPPs. A lot of those requirements, when we looked at planning permits and assessed them, we did a bit of an audit of a number of planning permits and assessed them against those provisions. In most instances, those permits that had been issued differed from what the actual requirements were in those clauses. So they weren't being met in any case. So then the real question is, what value are they adding to the system other than red tape? One of the things we were concerned about, though, was the amenity sort of impact and decision guidelines in those clauses of particular provisions. We wanted to make sure that they were still carried over in other parts of the scheme, and we identified in the zones and overlays where those permit triggers existed, the amenity and decision guidelines already existed. So we had some comfort moving forward that we could remove those 3 particular provisions. With regards to, I guess, some uses that we wanted to sort of facilitate some small business activities, or uses that would help facilitate small business activities. There was a report done in 2016 by DECHA, by the department, Small Business Regulation Review. And it identified a number of hurdles with regards to small businesses, especially small businesses setting up and establishing. So we had a bit of a look at that across the scheme, across the VPPs, and we identified a few uses where there really wasn't much benefit from requiring planning approval at all. And we looked at which zones would benefit from having a removal of a permit requirement for particular uses. So the ones that qualified in the end was the convenience shop and takeaway food premises in the Industrial 1 zone, and in the Industrial 3 zone, service industry, which includes motor repairs, and also takeaway food premises. So they don't require a planning permit now moving forward, but they did previous under the old provisions. Car parking. Now, we've had a few inquiries from customers and punters around car parking, and since VC 148 was introduced. There's really 2 streams, I reckon, with the changes for car parking. One of them relates to existing buildings. If you're in the sort of the commercial and activity centre type zones, if you've got an existing building and you're setting up a use or establishing a use, and you need a dispensation of 10 car spaces or less, no planning permit required now under those particular circumstances, with the exception is if a council or a municipality has a car parking overlay in place. It was important that we understood the valuable contributions that car parking overlays add to car parking infrastructure in local councils. So apart from that one exception, no planning permit required just for exemption for 10 car spaces in existing buildings in commercial and activity centre zones. So that's one stream, but I should say that we also did an audit of looking at planning permits where that was the sole trigger, and in 99% of cases that we looked at across the state, planning permits were issued. So again, what value was that adding to the system, the regulatory burden issue, etc., and that's why we decided to make them planning permit not required if they're getting issued 99% of the time. So the other stream that I mentioned, or two streams, is the principal public transport network area maps. And effectively what that means is if you're within 400 metres of the PPTN area maps, you have reduced car parking rates, basically column B. Now, it only obviously applies to Metropolitan Melbourne, doesn't apply to Regional Vic, because that's where the PPTN area maps apply, and they're based on information from Transport for Victoria. We expect those maps to be updated. There's a few minor issues with the maps that we've found in their introduction. We're aware of that, and we'll work with Transport for Victoria on making adjustments to those maps. But it's essentially Transport for Victoria's data. Those maps are an incorporated document. Now we know and we understand it's hard to read an incorporated document when you zoom into maps, when a line could be 50 metres thick. So the PPTN maps are available on VicPlan, which you'll see in a little bit later session at the end of today. So the go is with the PPTN maps is if your property touches, doesn't have to be wholly within. So if the corner of a property touches, you get column B rates effectively. And the important thing to note quickly on that one is that if you remember, column A requires visitor parking for dwellings for 5 or more dwellings. Well, that is now 0. So visitor parking is now gone under column B as well. So just be aware of that. That's an important change because we've had a few queries on that one coming in. Okay, very quickly, because I know it's a long stint, this middle section. Jen mentioned the heritage overlay. Again, statements of significance to be specified for each heritage place. Now in the overlay in the schedule, you've got some design guidelines as well can be put in the schedule. Just be aware with this one though, there's a 3-month transition from gazettal, but the 3-month transition lives within the clause itself. The heritage clause doesn't live within the ministerial direction. A subtle point, but just be aware of it. Don't go to your ministerial direction to get your transitional provisions. Go to your clauses and your ministerial directions if you're looking for stuff. Just a little tip, because I nearly got tripped up on that the other day. Okay, advertising signs, very quickly. Really, the VC 148 doesn't really change what you do and don't require a permit for with regards to signs. One thing we have done, we've removed the word advertising from the language throughout the scheme where possible. It'll still appear in local schedules. And the reason why we've removed advertising is we know signs are more than just advertising. For instance, there are also directional signs as well. So we've taken that. It's a small but important change. In addition to that, there was, as part of the discussion paper feedback, we received a few queries around the exempt signs section in 5205. And what I mean by exempt signs, you know how there's, I don't know, about 15 to 20 exempt signs in that list, in that clause. Quite often there was a bit of confusion amongst councils in particular about whether or not those exempt signs trumped other provisions in the scheme, i.e. the heritage overlay, which says you need a permit for any type of sign. We've now made it very clear in the clause 5205 that the exempt signs trump all other permit requirements for signs throughout the scheme. So it's removed that confusion. There was a few VCAT cases that popped up as well that we were aware of. The only other comment I'll make about signs is that, there was a Supreme Court decision in 2012 that talked about is a sign a use and or development or both, or so we've made it stick with me on this one, we've made it clear that a sign is a use, but in the scheme only a planning permit is required for development and not use. Yeah? So And that addresses that Supreme Court decision that said a sign can be a use. So no permit required for use for a sign, but permit required for development. Okay, very quickly, there was a couple of things mentioned about advisory notes and support documentation. 2 advisory notes, numbers 71 and 72. So this amendment needed 2 advisory notes because it was that chunky. We had to break it up into 2 advisory notes, one for PPF and one for everything else. Frequently asked questions that Jen mentioned before, there's actually 55 questions in there. We could have added another 20, but we had to stop at some point. So, but the big ticket items, you should be able to get an answer out of those 55 questions and answers. There's a summary of changes document as well on the website for VC 148. That's basically a user-friendly version of an explanatory report. Clause finder tool, which I absolutely love. I reckon it's great. I'd love for councils to use a clause finder tool when they do MSS changes and things like that, particularly where there's a heap of clauses being changed at once. That's available, and I'll give you a spin of that in a minute. And there's also a hard copy table online which actually says where each clause was and then where it's gone to, with a bit of an explanation. Thing is, with that hard copy, it's like 15 pages. You're better off to use the clause finder tool, which I'll show you right now very quickly. Now I'm hoping our internet is stable. Okay, so this, we'll see if it works. This is, okay, I can't show you the my favourite slide, so I'm extremely disappointed. Apologies for that. I'm sure you would have loved it. In any case, can I ask who's used the clause finder tool? Yep, I would have loved to have shown it too. All right, that's okay. So you've got a screenshot of it there. It's not live, but you've got a screenshot of it there. And in effect, what it does is on our left-hand side, you can type in. Okay, so this section here, you can type in there the old clause number. So if you've got a really good memory, as most of you do, you type in the clause number that you love, your favourite clause number. I don't know what that might be. Let's just say, call one out. It's okay. We don't have to do that because otherwise I would have punched it in. But say tourism. You would have punched in tourism on the left-hand side. A menu would have came down matching any word that has tourism in it, any word from a clause heading that has tourism in it. Or you could have put the clause number directly in as well. So it's a smart sort of preemptive search engine in there that sits behind it. If you would have typed in tourism at clause 1703, on the right-hand side, it would have said tourism has been renumbered and is now located at 1704. All right, so there's an example. There's one on the screen at the moment as well, which is bushfire protection. I know it's hard to read. The old clause, if you would have typed in bushfire, the old clause, it would have said on the left-hand side there, it was for 42.48. It's now at 52.12, and the notes on the bottom right-hand side, not these notes, but the notes there, says it's been renumbered and amended. Now, if you remember previously, I said there were 3 particular provisions that we deleted. One of those was a service station. So if you knew the old clause, or you just typed in service station on the left-hand side, it would have given you the clause number on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, it would have said deleted. The other thing to note is it works in the reverse. So if you now know the new clause number because it's in the scheme, you would click. You click on the right-hand side and it works in reverse. So it says, here's what the new clause number is for a clause. This is what it was, pre-VC 148. The other thing is, in a number of weeks, we're also hoping to link up the new VC 148 clause numbers in the search engine. So you'll know what the new clause number is and you can just click on it, it'll take you straight to the clause and open it for you. So that's an enhancement that's coming. Okay, a couple of things, and I'm nearly finished, so we're nearly going to go to questions very, very soon. Additional material coming soon, and Jen mentioned some of this. I will talk about using Victoria's planning system, and you guys, how many of you guys are familiar with that document? Not too many. Okay. It's about 200 pages long. Quite often you refer to it if you want to get some intel on what the intent and thinking behind was particular clauses or zones or overlays. There's also got other bits and pieces in there about Section 173 agreements, public acquisition overlays, and a heap of other stuff. That's getting a bit of a refresh and update. Look out for that in the future. That's more of a generic guide for the industry. With regards to, there's also some practice notes that'll be released as well. Obviously, when you make big changes through VC 148 and so on, you need to make changes to some of the practice notes as well. So just be aware that that's happening. The big ticket item for me is the practitioner's guide. It's looking to be about, give or take, 120 pages at the moment, latest version. Draft version. Look out for that one as well. That's coming out. Now that one for me is a big ticket item because essentially what it does is it sets out the rules for drafting. So it previously known as the VPP manual, so which was kicked off in the late 90s along with the introduction of the new format planning schemes. I remember using it, the VPP manual, but it actually hasn't had an update for a very long time. So we're giving that a total refresh, a total update. So that will help you draft planning provisions. It'll also help us with the PPF translation. It'll also help us on how to construct and amend a planning scheme. That's coming out soon. In addition to that, Jenny mentioned the PPF translation guide, which is specifically for the purple section that I mentioned that was on the screen before. So keep an eye out for those three things. I haven't got dates for you exactly on that, but they are coming. And I think I've said enough, and happy to open it up to questions on any of that long section that we just talked about. So anyone of the panel here can hopefully answer any of your questions. And we've got a microphone as well, I understand. And don't be scared, it's taped together, 2 microphones, one for audio recording and then one to hear us in the room. So don't get scared. So open to the floor.
It's just really a point of clarification. Just going back a few slides where it outlined, yes, this one. So the second last one you mentioned that with the reduced car parking requirements, if there is I can't even remember what they're called now, but the local car parking policy applies. Yes, so the car parking overlay applies, then that kind of overrides. Is that the same for that last one where it says the incorporated the principal public transport area maps? Okay, so it takes this one takes precedence.
Is relevant where you are looking for an exemption for 10 spaces or less.
Mm-hmm.
The application of the PPTA or principal public transport area maps is a separate line item in the provisions. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There's got to be some questions for Jen on the PPF stuff. Okay, you let us off very easy, so thank you for that. No, what we might do now is have a break. There's some food at the back there. That's a very long session, so thank you for sitting that out. There's more to come.